They dug the trench for their precious pipeline straight through the heart of my ranch, a scar of raw earth violating a century of my family's sweat and stewardship, and they didn't think I'd notice. Or perhaps they thought I wouldn't care, or most gallingly that I wouldn't dare. They were wrong on all counts. They mistook my initial measured silence, not for the stunned disbelief of a man witnessing an outrageous trespass, but for weakness. They would soon learn that my silence was merely the intake of breath before a very precise, very legal, and ultimately very, very permanent storm. It began, subtly, a distant hum of machinery that wasn't mine, carried on the prairie wind. I'd been out mending fences on the far western boundary, a good 5 miles from the main house, where the land rolls and dips before giving way to national forest. My wife, Clara, had packed me coffee, still warm in the thermos, and the morning was crisp, the kind that promises a good day's work. Then the sound, incongruous, persistent. I'm not an absentee landowner. I walk my acreage, know its contours, its game trails, its ancient oaks that were saplings when my great-grandfather first staked his claim. This sound was an intruder. I followed it, my gut tightening with each step. And there it was, a gash 50 yards wide, running arrow, straight across my pasture, heavy equipment parked idly by a stack of enormous steel pipes. No warning, no discussion, no easement filed or requested, just an invasion. The arrogance of it was breathtaking. This wasn't just about land. It was about a fundamental disrespect, a belief that they, the burgeoning Lakeside Estates Homeowners Association bordering my eastern fence line, could simply take what they wanted. Their sprawling, cookie-cutter development needed more water for its thirsty lawns and decorative fountains, and my land, apparently, was the most convenient route. I stood there for a long time, the thermos forgotten in my hand, the coffee growing cold. The fury was there, a hot, coiling thing in my chest, but it was banked, controlled. This wasn't a time for yelling at hired hands who were just following orders. This was a time for strategy. This was a time for law. And, if necessary, a time for a lesson that would be etched into their collective memory with the permanence of granite. They had mistaken my quiet demeanor, my preference for solitude and honest labor, for a lack of sophistication. They were about to discover just how sophisticated a pissed-off rancher with right on his side could be. The initial silence was over. The battle lines, quite literally, had been drawn across my property. The next morning, I drove my old pickup not towards my fields, but towards the sterile, manicured entrance of Lakeside Estates. Their HOA president, a man named Bartholomew Barty Higgins, held court in a small, ostentatious office just inside their faux stone gates. Higgins was a transplant, a former mid-level something or other from a city I didn't care to remember, who'd found his petty kingdom in the bylaws and covenants of this new development. He had a soft handshake and eyes that never quite met yours, always scanning for an advantage. I walked in without an appointment. The receptionist, a young woman who looked perpetually stressed, flinched when I stated my business. Higgins emerged, all feigned bonhomie and cheap cologne. "Ah, our neighbor," he boomed, extending a hand I didn't take. "Come to welcome us to the, area properly." His smile was a predatory slickness. I kept my voice low, devoid of the anger that simmered just beneath the surface. "Mr. Higgins, you're digging a pipeline across my land. My private property." He blinked, the smile faltering for a microsecond before snapping back into place, wider this time, more condescending. "Oh, that, a minor utility corridor, necessary for progress, you understand. We're bringing much-needed infrastructure to the community." He gestured vaguely eastward, as if bestowing a great gift. "It's not a minor utility corridor, Higgins. It's trespass. It's illegal construction. You had no right." My words were flat, each one a carefully placed stone. Higgins actually chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. Now, no need for such harsh language. I'm sure we filed all the necessary paperwork, county approvals, that sort of thing. Probably just a clerical oversight you weren't notified." Liar. The ease with which it slid off his tongue was infuriating. "There are no county approvals for digging on my land without my permission or a legal easement, Higgins. And there are no easements." I saw a flicker of something in his eyes then. Not concern, but annoyance. I was an inconvenience, a fly in his ointment. "Look," he said, dropping the pretense of friendliness, his voice hardening. "That pipeline is going through. It's vital. If you have some pecuniary concerns, perhaps we can discuss a modest one-time access fee. Say, $500 for the trouble? $500. For bisecting my ranch, for threatening my water table, for the sheer unmitigated gall of his theft. My daughter, Lily, had found a nest of burrowing owls near that section last spring. We'd spent weeks watching the owlets. Now, their habitat was likely destroyed. This wasn't just about fences and dirt. It was about memory, about legacy, about the heart of my family's life. The controlled fury I'd maintained began to strain at its leash. "Mr. Higgins," I said, and my voice was so quiet it seemed to suck the air from the room. "You will cease all work immediately. You will remove your equipment and your pipes from my property. And then, you will restore my land to its original condition. If this is not underway by sunset today, you will hear from my attorney." He puffed up, his face reddening. "Are you threatening me? I am the president of this homeowners association. We have a board. We have lawyers too, you know." His voice rose, cracking slightly on the last word. "Good. Let him feel a sliver of the pressure. I am stating a fact, Mr. Higgins. You are trespassing. You are engaged in illegal activity. And you will be held accountable." I turned and walked out, the receptionist staring with wide, frightened eyes. The battle was joined. He had no idea who he was dealing with. He just saw a rancher. He didn't see the years I'd spent navigating complex contracts in a former life. A life I'd left behind for the peace of this land. A peace he was now so crudely attempting to shatter. He would learn. Sarah Jenkins was a young lawyer, hungry and sharp, with an office in the old part of town, above a bakery that smelled of yeast and cinnamon. She didn't have a fancy degree from an Ivy League school, but she had a reputation for tenacity and a deep-seated hatred for bullies. When I laid out the situation, her eyes lit up with a righteous fire I recognized. "They did what?" she asked, leaning forward, all traces of initial legal formality gone. "No easement, no notification, just started digging?" I nodded, handing her the plat maps of my ranch, the original deed, my property tax records. "Higgins offered me $500 for my trouble," Sarah snorted. "Generous of him. Sounds like a classic case of arrogant overreach. These HOAs, some of them think they're sovereign nations." She spread the maps on her worn mahogany desk. "Okay, first things first. Cease and desist letter, hand-delivered by a process server this afternoon. We'll file for an immediate injunction to halt construction. Then, we sue for trespass, damages, and full restoration. And Higgins. We'll make sure Higgins understands the meaning of personal liability if he directed this." Her smile was grimly satisfying. Over the next few days, the legal machinery ground into motion. The cease and desist was served. Higgins, true to form, initially tried to ignore it. A crew showed up the next morning, only to be met by a county sheriff Sarah had alerted, who politely but firmly explained the legal ramifications of violating the notice. The heavy equipment fell silent. Then came the predictable HOA bluster. Their lawyer, a slick city type named Marcus Thorne, called Sarah, full of condescending pronouncements about eminent domain principles, which didn't apply, and community necessity, irrelevant to illegal trespass. Sarah, bless her, ate him for lunch. I heard her end of one call. Mr. Thorne, your client appears to believe that wishful thinking constitutes a legal basis for grand larceny. It does not. The next piece of heavy equipment that rolls onto my client's property without a court order will be impounded, and your client will be facing contempt charges so fast his manicured toupee will spin. Thorne, I gathered, was not used to being spoken to that way. Meanwhile, I documented everything. Photographs of the trench, the pipes, the disturbed soil. I hired a certified surveyor, old Jebediah Hanks, who'd surveyed this land for my father, to confirm the boundary lines. His report an ironclad testament to the HOA's encroachment. Jebediah, a man of few words and even fewer smiles, actually grunted with something approaching satisfaction as he drove the new survey stakes. Always knew that fella Higgins was a damn fool, he muttered, spitting tobacco juice. Thinks a fancy title makes him king. Land don't care about titles. Land knows who it belongs to. The Lakeside Estates residents were mostly oblivious, cocooned in their world of matching mailboxes and lawn care contracts. A few, however, started asking questions when the pipeline work abruptly stopped. Whispers began. Higgins, I heard, was telling people I was an unreasonable recluse, holding up progress for selfish reasons. Let him. The truth had a way of surfacing, especially when propelled by legal filings. The initial court hearing for the injunction was a taste of what was to come. Higgins sat there, smug and self-important, next to Thorne, who looked increasingly uncomfortable as Sarah laid out the blatant illegality. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Esther Riley, who'd grown up on a farm herself, listened patiently, her expression unreadable. When Sarah finished, Judge Riley looked at Thorne. Mr. Thorne, does your client dispute the property lines as presented? Do they have any documentation, any easement, any permit that allows them to be on Mr. Henderson's land? Thorne cleared his throat. Your Honor, we believe there was a misunderstanding regarding implied consent and the pressing need for... Judge Riley cut him off. Implied consent to excavate a 50-yard trench and lay industrial pipeline? Mr. Thorne, please. The injunction was granted. Work was officially, legally, halted. Higgins' face was a study in controlled rage. He knew, I think, that he'd badly miscalculated, but he still didn't understand the depth of my resolve, or the resources I was prepared to bring to bear. He still thought this was just about money. The lawsuit proceeded, a slow, grinding process that nonetheless moved with a satisfying inexorability. Sarah was meticulous, building a case so airtight it could have floated. Discovery was a particular joy. We requested every HOA board meeting minute, every email, every internal memo related to the pipeline project. What emerged was a picture of astonishing arrogance and incompetence, spearheaded by Higgins. He'd steamrollered the project through, assuring his board that the old rancher next door wouldn't be a problem, that a token payment would smooth things over. There were even emails where Higgins dismissed concerns from his own treasurer, a hesitant woman named Carol Bethune, about the lack of proper legal groundwork. Carol, leave the strategy to me. It's better to ask forgiveness than permission with these country types. He'll grumble, we'll give him a few bucks, and it'll be done. Sarah read that one aloud to me with a wolfish grin. Higgins, in his infinite wisdom, decided that the best defense was a good offense. Suddenly, I started receiving violation notices from Lakeside Estates. My fence, apparently, the one that had stood for 70 years and was 10 feet inside my property line from their development, was not of an approved color. The ancient, magnificent oak tree near my driveway, whose branches merely overhung the air above a rarely used HOA common path 50 yards away, was deemed a potential hazard, requiring immediate and costly pruning by their approved arborist. It was so transparently retaliatory, so petty, it was almost comical. Almost, because behind the absurdity was a vindictive spirit that sought to harass and intimidate. They're trying to bleed you with nuisance complaints, hoping you'll drop the pipeline suit out of sheer frustration, Sarah explained, though her tone suggested she found it more amusing than threatening. Don't worry, we'll swat these down like flies. And she did. For each violation, she fired back a scathing legal response, citing relevant case law on property rights and harassment, often CCing county officials just to make sure Lakeside Estates knew their nonsense was being documented beyond our private battle. The fence color was irrelevant, as it wasn't subject to their covenants. The tree was a natural feature on my land, posing no demonstrable risk, and their demand was an attempt at unauthorized alteration of my property. One by one, the violation notices stopped, but not before further exposing Higgins's character to the wider community. Some Lakeside residents, initially swayed by Higgins's narrative of the unreasonable rancher, started to see the pattern of bullying. Old Mrs. Henderson, whose prize-winning roses had been cited for being excessively fragrant, a complaint later traced back to Higgins's wife, who suffered from hay fever, quietly approached me one day at the feed store. "Mr. Henderson," she'd whispered, "don't you let that Barty Higgins push you around. He's a menace." She wasn't the only one. The tide of local opinion, initially indifferent or mildly hostile, was beginning to turn. Higgins, in his clumsy attempts to intimidate me, was only succeeding in isolating himself and making my case stronger. He was digging his own hole deeper, one petty violation at a time. The pressure was building, not just on him, but on his entire HOA board, who were starting to realize their president was a liability with a capital L. The quiet satisfaction of watching a bully's plan unravel was considerable. The real victory, however, was still to come. The trial date arrived on a crisp autumn morning. The courtroom was small, but packed. Several Lakeside Estates residents were present, including the nervous treasurer, Carol Bethune, and a few other board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Higgins sat at the defendant's table, attempting an air of bored confidence, but the slight tremor in his hands when he adjusted his tie gave him away. Sarah was calm, organized. Her opening statement, a masterpiece of concise, factual indictment. She laid out the timeline, the property records, the photographic evidence, the utter lack of any legal justification for the HOA's actions. It was like watching a skilled surgeon at work, each incision precise and purposeful. When it was Thorne's turn, he stumbled. His defense was a weak concoction of community good and procedural misunderstandings. Judge Riley listened, her gaze unwavering, occasionally interrupting with a pointed question that Thorne struggled to answer. "Mr. Thorne, is it your contention that the community good, as you put it, allows an entity to simply seize private land without due process or compensation?" Thorne paled. "No, Your Honor. Of course not. But you did it anyway," Judge Riley finished for him. The presentation of our evidence was straightforward. Jebediah Hanks, the surveyor, was irascible and unimpeachable on the stand, his testimony about the boundary lines unshakable. I testified about the discovery of the pipeline, the confrontation with Higgins, the damage to my land, the disruption to my livelihood and peace of mind. I kept my answers short, factual, my voice even. I didn't need to embellish. The facts themselves were damning enough. The highlight, however, was when Sarah called Bartholomew Higgins to the stand, Thorne objected, of course, but was overruled. Higgins swaggered slightly as he took his seat, trying to project authority. It didn't last long. Under Sarah's polite but relentless questioning, his composure began to crack. "Mr. Higgins, did you, or did you not, instruct contractors to begin excavation on Mr. Henderson's property?" "Well, the board approved the project." "That's not my question, Mr. Higgins. Did you instruct them to dig on land you knew, or should have known, belonged to Mr. Henderson?" He blustered. He evaded. He tried to shift blame. Sarah would patiently circle back, her voice never rising, her questions like scalpels. She presented his own emails, the ones where he dismissed concerns about legality. "Is this your email, Mr. Higgins?" she'd ask, an almost gentle inquiry. "Where you state it's better to ask forgiveness than permission." The color drained from Higgins' face. He looked at his lawyer, who offered no help. He looked at the judge, who watched him with cold disapproval. He looked at the lakeside residents in the gallery, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning anger. The man who had presented himself as their strong leader was being revealed as a reckless fool, a petty tyrant who had exposed them all to significant legal and financial jeopardy. By the time Sarah was finished with him, Higgins was a deflated balloon, his arrogance replaced by a sullen resentment. Thorne's redirect was brief and ineffective. He knew they were sunk. Closing arguments were almost a formality. Sarah summarized the overwhelming evidence of trespass, the blatant disregard for the law, the damages incurred. Thorne could only offer platitudes about community spirit, which sounded hollow even to his own ears. Judge Riley announced she would deliver her judgment the following week. The week crawled by. I tried to keep busy on the ranch, mending fences, checking on the herd, but my mind was often in that courtroom. Clara, ever my rock, just squeezed my hand and said, "Justice will be done, John. You stood up for what's right." Finally, the day arrived. The courtroom was even more crowded this time. The tension was palpable. Judge Riley entered, took her seat, and wasted no time. Her voice was clear, firm, leaving no room for ambiguity. She recapped the facts of the case, her summary a brutal condemnation of the HOA's actions. The court finds that the Lakeside Estates Homeowners Association did knowingly and illegally trespass upon the property of Mr. John Henderson. They did so without permission, without legal easement, and in blatant disregard for established property rights. A murmur went through the courtroom. Higgins sat ramrod straight, his face ashen. The court further finds that the actions of the HOA, under the direction of its president, Mr. Bartholomew Higgins, were not accidental, but constituted a deliberate attempt to appropriate Mr. Henderson's land for their own purposes, displaying a remarkable degree of arrogance and contempt for the law. She paused, her gaze sweeping over Higgins, then the HOA board members. Therefore, this court orders the following. 1. Lakeside Estates OA is to immediately cease and desist from any further presence on Mr. Henderson's property. 2. Lakeside Estates HOA is to remove, at its own sole expense, all pipes, equipment, and materials from Mr. Henderson's land within 30 days of this judgment. 3. Lakeside Estates HOA is to restore Mr. Henderson's land to its original condition, or as close thereto as is reasonably possible, under the supervision of a court-appointed environmental consultant, again at their sole expense. 4. Lakeside Estates HOA is to pay Mr. Henderson damages in the sum of, and she named a figure that made Higgins gasp audibly, a figure that covered not just the physical damage but also punitive damages for their outrageous conduct. Finally, she added, and Mr. Henderson's legal fees will also be borne by the HOA. It was a complete and total victory. Sarah squeezed my arm under the table. I felt a wave of profound relief, mixed with a grim satisfaction. As Judge Riley adjourned, the courtroom erupted in quiet chaos. HOA board members were surrounding Thorne, their faces etched with panic and anger. Higgins was just sitting there, staring blankly ahead, a broken man. Several Lakeside residents came up to me, offering apologies, expressing their dismay at Higgins's actions. Carol Bethune, the treasurer, looked particularly shaken. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice trembling, "I am so sorry. We should have listened." I simply nodded. The fight was won, but a new one was about to begin, ensuring compliance. I had a feeling Higgins and his cronies wouldn't make it easy, but they still didn't know the full extent of my resourcefulness. They thought the judgment was the end. For them, it was just the beginning of the true cost of their folly. The 30-day deadline for pipe removal approached, and the silence from Lakeside Estates was deafening. Not a single piece of equipment had appeared on my land. Not one section of pipe had been disturbed. Higgins, it seemed, was operating under the delusion that if he ignored the court order, it would magically disappear. Or perhaps he was scrambling, trying to find a contractor willing to undertake the now much more complicated and reputation-damaging task of removing his folly. Sarah filed a motion for contempt of court on day 31. Judge Riley, predictably, was not amused. She scheduled an emergency hearing. At that hearing, Thorne, looking utterly defeated, explained that the HOA was having difficulty securing bids for the removal work, citing the unusual nature of the site. It was a pathetic excuse. The truth was, no reputable contractor wanted to touch a job so mired in legal muck and bad publicity, especially when the HOA's ability to pay was becoming increasingly questionable given the damages awarded. Judge Riley gave them another 7 days, with a stern warning that daily fines for non-compliance would commence thereafter, fines that would make the initial damages look like pocket change. And still, nothing. The pipes lay there, a rusting monument to HOA arrogance. It was during this period of malicious non-compliance, this blatant thumbing of the nose at the justice system, that the idea began to solidify in my mind. It wasn't born of malice, not entirely. It was born of a cold, hard pragmatism and a deep-seated belief that actions must have tangible, unavoidable consequences. If they wouldn't remove their pipes, they would certainly have a much harder time doing so after I modified them. I still had my old concrete mixer, a sturdy, reliable beast I used for fence posts and small repairs around the ranch. It wasn't a massive industrial unit, but it was more than capable for the task I envisioned. I also had a good supply of sand and gravel from a pit on my back 40, and Portland cement was easily procured from the local hardware store. The beauty of it was its simplicity, its permanence. They wanted their pipes on my land so badly. Fine. They could have them, just not in a usable condition. My land, my rules, and my concrete. I discussed the general principle with Sarah, careful not to lay out the specifics of my burgeoning plan. If they refuse to remove the pipeline as ordered, I asked, and it continues to constitute a trespass and a nuisance on my property, what are my rights to mitigate that nuisance myself, especially if their inaction is causing ongoing harm or preventing full restoration? Sarah, ever the sharp one, looked at me with a knowing glint in her eye. Legally, John, once they've defied a court order for removal, and if the materials themselves constitute an ongoing hazard or impediment, you could argue necessity in abating that nuisance. Especially if you document everything meticulously. However, she added, her voice taking on a more cautious tone, such self-help remedies can be risky, if not handled perfectly. The cleanest path is continued court enforcement. I understood. But the courts moved slowly, and Higgins was counting on that. He was counting on wearing me down. He didn't understand that my patience, while considerable, had been replaced by a rancher's resolve to deal with the problem directly and effectively. The idea felt right. It felt like the kind of justice the land itself would mete out. Silent, implacable, and utterly final. The pipes were a blight, an open wound. Filling them wouldn't heal the land immediately, but it would be a decisive act, a statement that this violation would not stand, not in any form. It would also make their eventual court-compelled removal an exponentially more expensive and laborious nightmare for the HOA. A fitting consequence, I thought, for their initial theft and subsequent defiance. The planning phase was almost meditative. I spent evenings in my workshop, sketching out the logistics. The pipeline, as it lay exposed in the trench, had several access points where sections joined. These would be my primary targets. I calculated the volume needed. It was substantial, but manageable with my mixer over a few dedicated nights. The key was discretion and timing. I waited for a new moon, for nights when the prairie would be cloaked in an impenetrable darkness. Clara knew something was afoot. She didn't ask directly, but her gaze was knowing, supportive. "Be careful, John," was all she said, laying a hand on my arm one evening. Lily, now a young woman with her mother's perceptiveness and my stubborn streak, just grinned. "Give 'em hell, Dad." My hidden credentials here were simply a lifetime of practical engineering born from necessity. Ranchers fix what's broken, build what's needed, and understand the properties of materials like concrete better than most desk jockeys. This wasn't some arcane skill. It was common sense, amplified by determination. On the first designated night, under a starless sky, I loaded the mixer onto my flatbed trailer, along with bags of cement, shovels, and water barrels. I drove without lights, navigating by instinct and the faint silhouette of the tree line against the slightly less black sky. The silence of the ranch at night was absolute, broken only by the distant yip of a coyote and the crunch of my tires on the dirt track. I worked methodically, starting at the easternmost accessible point of the pipeline on my property, the section closest to lakeside estates. Mix a batch, pour it into the pipe's gaping maw, wait for it to settle, mix another. The wet suck and gurgle of the concrete flowing into the steel was a deeply satisfying sound. It was the sound of a problem being irrevocably solved. Each batch was a prayer for justice, a testament to resilience. This is for the owls, Higgins. Slosh. This is for the disruption. Gurgle. This is for the arrogance. Thump. I worked through the night, a silent, determined wraith under the vast, indifferent sky. By dawn, a significant length of their precious pipeline was no longer a hollow conduit, but a solid, immovable cylinder of reinforced concrete. I cleaned my equipment meticulously, leaving no trace, and was back at the house, sipping coffee on the porch as the sun crested the horizon, just another rancher starting his day. I repeated the process over the next 2 nights, moving along the pipeline, filling section after section. It was hard, physical labor, but fueled by a cold, righteous anger, it felt almost effortless. I imagined Higgins's face when he finally realized what had happened. The thought brought a grim smile to my lips. This wasn't just about stopping the water. It was about making a statement so clear, so unequivocal, that it could never be misunderstood. You trespass on my land. You violate a court order. You will deal with consequences that are as solid and unyielding as the earth itself. On the 3rd morning, as I surveyed my handiwork, or rather the lack of any visible change, as all the work was inside the pipes, I felt a sense of profound, if temporary, peace. The ball was now squarely, and much more heavily, in their court. The discovery, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic, at least initially. A week after Judge Riley's extended deadline passed, with daily fines now accruing, a reluctant-looking crew from a cut-rate plumbing outfit finally showed up. They weren't equipped for pipe removal, just inspection. I watched from a distance as they poked and prodded, presumably trying to figure out why the sections felt unusually heavy. Then one of them tried to run a snake camera down a pipe. I saw him frown, try again, then call over his supervisor. There was much head-scratching, some banging on the exterior of a pipe with a wrench, which produced a dull, solid thud instead of a resonant clang. The supervisor made a call. An hour later, a flustered-looking Marcus Thorne, the HOA's lawyer, arrived, followed shortly by a sputtering, apoplectic Bartholomew Higgins. His face, when he realized what he was looking at, or rather, not looking through, was a masterpiece of impotent fury. He stomped over to the nearest pipe section, kicked it, hurting his foot, I imagine, though he tried to hide the wince, and then turned, his face a mottled purple, and actually screamed. It wasn't a word, just a raw, incoherent sound of pure, unadulterated rage and disbelief. It echoed across my pasture, and I swear even the cows looked up. Thorne was trying to calm him, speaking in low, urgent tones, but Higgins was beyond reason. He started pointing at my house, gesticulating wildly, his voice now carrying clearly. "Henderson, I'll have him arrested. Vandalism, destruction of property." I almost laughed. His property? On my land? After a court ordered him to remove it? The irony was delicious. Sarah, whom I'd alerted to the crew's arrival, pulled up in her sensible sedan. She got out, cool and collected, and walked towards the commotion. "Mr. Higgins, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice carrying easily. "Is there a problem? I thought you were here to comply with Judge Riley's order to remove this pipeline." Thorne looked like he'd swallowed a toad. "Ms. Jenkins, it appears, the pipes, they're filled with concrete." Sarah feigned mild surprise. "Concrete? Dear me, how unfortunate. I suppose that will make the removal process rather more challenging, wouldn't you say? And significantly more expensive," Higgins rounded on her. "Your client did this. He's sabotaged our property." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Higgins, this pipeline is currently trespassing on my client's land. It is, by court order, your responsibility to remove it. Its current internal composition, while perhaps inconvenient for you, doesn't change that fact. In fact, it makes its removal all the more urgent, wouldn't you agree? It's quite an eyesore, and I imagine the environmental impact of leaving concrete-filled steel pipes buried indefinitely would be frowned upon by the authorities. The sheer, unmitigated cost of what they now faced began to dawn on the HOA representatives. Removing hollow pipes was one thing. Removing pipes that were essentially solid concrete logs, each weighing many tons, would require heavy cranes, specialized cutting equipment, and a vastly larger, more skilled, and exponentially more expensive workforce. The original estimate for removal, which they'd already balked at, would now be a pittance compared to the new reality. Several Lakeside Estates board members, who had belatedly arrived, were now gathered in a horrified huddle. Carol Bethune, the treasurer, looked physically ill. This was going to bankrupt the HOA, or, at the very least, require a special assessment so colossal it would cause a resident revolt. The public humiliation was complete. Here was their grand pipeline project. Not only a legal disaster, but now a literal, concrete boat anchor around their necks. The news spread like wildfire through Lakeside Estates. Higgins's reign of error was spectacularly, publicly over. My phone started ringing, reporters from the local paper, even a stringer for a regional news outlet. The story of the concrete-filled pipeline and the defiant rancher was, apparently, good copy. The fallout was swift and brutal for Higgins and the HOA. An emergency Lakeside Estates residents meeting was called. It was, by all accounts, a bloodbath. Higgins tried to bluster. To blame me. To blame the contractors. To blame the alignment of the planets. But the residents, armed with the facts, the court judgment, and the dawning realization of the monumental bill heading their way, were having none of it. He was shouted down, called a fool, a tyrant, and several other less charitable terms. By the end of the meeting, a vote of no confidence was passed, and Bartholomew Higgins was unceremoniously stripped of his presidency. He resigned from the board entirely the next day, a broken and humiliated man. Good riddance. The HOA, now under new, more sensible and terrified leadership, had no choice but to comply. They had to take out massive loans, levy a truly painful special assessment on all homeowners, and hire a specialized industrial demolition crew. The process of removing those concrete-filled pipes was a slow, laborious, and incredibly expensive ordeal. It took weeks. Heavy cranes lumbered onto my land, this time with my explicit, written permission for the sole purpose of removal. The noise of concrete saws and jackhammers echoed for days as they painstakingly cut the pipeline into manageable sections. Each groan of stressed metal, each shatter of concrete, was music to my ears. It was the sound of justice being done, albeit expensively for them. The trench they had dug was now wider, uglier, as they struggled to extract the heavy, inert masses. But, piece by piece, it came out. My ranch was slowly being cleansed of their trespass. Once the last section was gone, the court-appointed environmental consultant oversaw the restoration. Topsoil was brought in, the contours regraded, native grasses seeded. It would take time for the land to fully heal, for the scar to fade, but the process had begun. The new HOA president, a quiet accountant named Henderson, no relation, ironically, approached me sheepishly one afternoon as the last of the restoration crew packed up. He handed me a check for the court-ordered damages and my legal fees. "Mr. Henderson," he said, his voice sincere, "on behalf of Lakeside Estates, I want to offer our deepest apologies. What happened was inexcusable. We've learned a very hard lesson." I looked him in the eye. He seemed genuine. "See that it doesn't happen again," I said, my tone leaving no room for misinterpretation. He nodded quickly. "It won't, sir, I assure you. The legal battle was over. The physical battle was won." Sitting on my porch that evening, Clara beside me, Lily home from college for the weekend, I watched the sun set over my land. The prairie grasses whispered in the evening breeze. The distant mountains were purple in the fading light. The scar was still there, a paler shade of green than the surrounding pasture, but it was healing. My coffee was warm. Peace, hard-earned and fiercely defended, settled over the ranch. They had tried to take a piece of my soul, and instead, they'd found themselves buried in concrete consequences. Let it be a lesson. This land has a long memory, and so do I.